Welcome to the debate, the blue trauma. Who protects the protectors? Today, we analyze the ideas from the book Shielded Minds, Navigating Burnout and Trauma in Law Enforcement.
It's a heavy one today.
It really is. I want everyone to just imagine clearing the scene of a catastrophic highway collision. Your heart is hammering at 160 beats per minute?
Oh, at least. Adrenaline is just flooding your system.
Exactly. Your hands are literally shaking from the physical exertion of pulling someone from a wreck. And then, before you can even wash the blood off your hands, dispatch sends you to settle a noise complaint over a barking dog.
Talk about absolute whiplash.
Right. And today, we're looking at the invisible compounding toll of that exact whiplash. We are talking about the silent scars of chronic stress, trauma, and burnout on law enforcement professionals. And let's be clear right at the top. This isn't just about feeling tired at the end of a long rotation.
No, not at all.
We are looking at a severe, major life challenge. We're talking about depersonalization, that creeping, hardened cynicism, where a civilian in genuine distress starts to look like just another piece of paperwork, or worse, a threat.
Yeah, it's a deeply reduced sense of personal accomplishment, where heroic efforts just feel like, tossing pebbles into an overflowing ocean. It is a severe compounding crisis that hides behind a cultural shield. Right, because the uniform projects this aura of unwavering resolve, but beneath the Kevlar and the badge, the distress is entirely internalized. The empirical reality is grim. We are looking at populations with significantly higher rates of clinical depression, suicidal ideation, and complex trauma than the citizens they patrol.
Which means the stakes of what we're unpacking today really couldn't be higher. We are examining the practical efficacy of the specific physiological and psychological interventions proposed to combat this crisis.
Exactly. But, and here is where I hit a wall. When I look at the gritty, hyper-vigilant reality of patrol work, I have to ask, are these proposed interventions actually realistic?
Well, I think because expecting a mindful pause or a gratitude practice from someone who just bagged evidence at a violent crime scene feels, frankly, dangerously naive to me. I'm deeply concerned that treating systemic occupational trauma with individual, self-led care routines risks putting a psychological Band-Aid on a gaping wound. We're looking at micro-interventions in a macro-trauma environment. Does that even survive contact with reality?
I hear that. I really do. But I look at the exact same environment and see these methods not as, soft wellness tips, but as absolute, mandatory biological imperatives.
Biological imperatives?
Yes. The foundation of these interventions isn't some superficial self-help philosophy. It's rigorous biological logic. Trauma, especially in this context, is not just a heavy mental burden or an intrusive memory. It is an incomplete physiological response.
Okay, explain that.
Well, when an officer faces a critical incident, the body mobilizes massive amounts of energy for survival. If that cycle isn't completed, that energy becomes frozen in the body. If an officer does not actively complete the stress cycle to engage the parasympathetic nervous system, their amygdala remains permanently hyperactive.
So they're just stuck in fight or flight.
Exactly. It is a state of perpetual alarm that systematically destroys their cardiovascular health, their emotional regulation, and their operational effectiveness. These proposals, they are mandatory biological resets to save their lives.
All right, well, let's test the mechanics of that reset in the real world, starting with this idea of completing the stress cycle in real time.
Sure.
In a vacuum, moving from activation to de-escalation makes perfect biological sense. But look at the operational timeline of the job. It's like revving a car engine to the red line in neutral.
Right. The body just generated all the fuel and RPMs to fight or run for its life, but the officer has to stand perfectly still, take notes, and write a report. That energy has to go somewhere, and it ends up tearing the engine apart.
Which is exactly why they need to intervene.
But how? How exactly does an officer physically release that fight or flight energy in the front seat of a Ford Explorer? We're basically asking them to achieve Zen enlightenment with a crackling radio and a CAD system blinking at them. Does this actually work when the shift never stops?
It has to work, because the alternative is biological collapse. And completing the stress cycle doesn't require a 1-hour gym session mid-shift or achieving Zen enlightenment, as you put it.
Okay, then what does it look like practically? The biological necessity of cycle completion is precisely what makes these micro-interventions so critical. We are talking about specific, targeted breathwork techniques, like box breathing, inhaling for 4, holding for 4, exhaling for 4, or diaphragmatic breathing.
Just breathing.
It's not just calming down, no. They are mechanical levers. When you engage in deep, rhythmic, diaphragmatic breathing, you are physically expanding the lungs to press on the diaphragm, which directly stimulates the vagus nerve.
Right, the vagus nerve.
Yeah, and the vagus nerve then sends a powerful, overriding signal to the brain, forcing the autonomic nervous system out of sympathetic dominance and into the rest and digest state. You are actively neutralizing the immediate chemical dump of adrenaline and cortisol, right there in the squad car.
Okay, but hold on. A chemical dump of that magnitude is a massive physiological event. I mean, the sympathetic nervous system has just shunted blood to the major muscles, dilated the pupils, shut down non-essential digestion.
All survival mechanisms, yes.
Right. So expecting a 4-second breathing count to serve as a sufficient brake against a system optimized over millions of years of evolution to keep a primate alive in lethal danger, that seems wildly disproportionate.
It's not about proportion, it's about hacking the biology.
But it assumes a level of cognitive control that the biological response itself is specifically designed to bypass. When the prefrontal cortex goes offline during a severe threat, how does the officer even remember to count their breaths?
Because it becomes muscle memory through consistent, proactive practice. You train the breath exactly like you train a tactical reload or a weapon draw.
A tactical reload is physical, tangible.
So is the diaphragm. By the time the prefrontal cortex is impaired by this stress response, the body already knows how to deploy the vagus nerve stimulation automatically. The parasympathetic system is just as evolved as the sympathetic system. It is a mechanical certainty, not a cognitive choice.
If they can remember to initiate it.
The body simply cannot maintain a state of sheer, unbridled panic if the physiology of the breath is artificially locked into a rhythm of safety. It forces the biology to stand down.
You say it becomes muscle memory, but muscle memory requires a predictable environment. A tactical reload happens the same way every time. The magazine is always in the same pouch. The magwell is always in the same place.
And your lungs are always in your chest.
True, but an involuntary trauma trigger doesn't work like a standardized drill. It is chaotic by definition. Which brings us to the accumulated backlog of trauma. Because if we generously accept that breathwork might offer a momentary reset for a single call,
Which I argue it does.
fine. We still have to address the persistent repeated exposure that transforms into complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD. And here's where the live proposals start to look like trying to put out a forest fire with the garden hose.
I have to disagree there. The garden hose analogy assumes the fire is all burning in one single place, which fundamentally misunderstands how CPTSD operates in the nervous system.
But CPTSD is chronic exposure. It alters a person's identity, their sense of self-worth, their core emotional regulation. The body literally becomes a repository of sensory triggers.
Yes, which is why somatic approaches are so vital.
But the proposals suggest utilizing somatic experiencing, specifically techniques like titration and pendulation. What are the actual risks of self-administering these techniques when an officer is facing intense, involuntary sensory triggers? We aren't talking about a bad memory. We are talking about the smell of burnt flesh or the specific pitch of a screaming child.
Let's break down exactly why those somatic tools are the only effective way to address those exact sensory triggers. Top-down, cognitive talking therapies often fail frontline heroes because the trauma isn't stored in the logical brain.
Right, they can't logic their way out of a sensory flashback.
Exactly. You can't outthink the smell of burnt rubber or a screaming pitch. The body remembers the threat and reacts involuntarily before the conscious mind even registers what's happening. That is why bottom-up resourcing tools are vital.
Okay, so define titration and pendulation for this context.
Titration is approaching difficult internal sensations in tiny, manageable doses. Pendulation is rhythmically shifting attention between an area of tension and an area of calm. We're not putting out the whole fire at once. We're doing controlled burns.
Controlled burns. Interesting.
Yeah. By forcing the brain to oscillate between the trauma trigger and a safe physical sensation, pendulation literally builds new neural pathways. It proves to the amygdala in real time that the threat is in the past, breaking the neurological loop of the freeze response.
I get the theory, but walk through the actual application of that, though. Imagine the risk of doing a controlled burn on your own psyche when you are isolated in a patrol car at 3 a.m.
It's not about diving into the deepest trauma,
But an officer experiences a sudden, overwhelming trigger. They attempt to self-administer titration. They focus on the physical sensation of the panic in their chest. What happens if the dosage is wrong?
Well,
What happens if focusing on the somatic reality of the trauma actually pulls them deeper into it, throwing them into an incapacitating panic attack or a full dissociative episode right when the radio goes off and they need to be operational? The proposal treats highly specialized, clinically supervised therapeutic modalities as if they are field stripping a weapon that you can just do on the hood of your car.
And that is exactly why pendulation is inextricably paired with titration. You never just focus on the trauma. The technique requires first establishing a resourced or calm sensation in the body.
So they have to find calm first.
Yes. So, sitting in that cruiser at 3 a.m., the officer first anchors into the feeling of their duty boots solidly on the floorboard or the neutral texture of the steering wheel in their hands. They dip into the tension, that panic in the chest, for maybe 2 seconds, and then deliberately, mechanically shift focus back to the boots on the floorboard.
Just bouncing back and forth.
Right. It builds interoception. It trains the nervous system that it can experience the discomfort of the trauma trigger and successfully return to safety. It breaks the cycle of the body believing it is perpetually under attack.
But it requires an environment that allows for vulnerability and slow, deliberate processing. If the radio demands an immediate response to a violent domestic dispute in the middle of that oscillation, the cycle is shattered.
Over time, the trigger loses its incapacitating power because the body has learned a physical pathway out of the free state. Even if it gets interrupted, the repeated practice of returning to a resource state lowers the baseline hypervigilance. The nervous system's window of tolerance expands.
Okay, well, let's talk about that window of tolerance because it leads directly into the tension between individual fortitude and the systemic burden.
A huge point of friction, yes.
Massive. The proposals heavily feature cognitive frameworks like a Resilience Reimagined toolkit, which focuses on cognitive reframing, realistic optimism, and self-compassion. Are they? It tells officers to set boundaries to avoid human giver syndrome, this idea that they must continuously sacrifice themselves for the public good. But asking an officer to set boundaries and employ realistic optimism unfairly shifts the burden of a broken, impossibly demanding system entirely onto the shoulders of the individual.
Equipping an individual with the tools to survive an inherently abrasive profession cannot be seen as a negative. You have to armor the individual first.
It is a negative when it absolves the institution. Think about the friction between biology and police administration. If an agency expects an officer to be a perpetual sponge for societal despair, working forced overtime because of understaffing, navigating completely broken judicial systems, and dealing with intense public scrutiny, telling that officer they just need better boundaries is gaslighting.
It's not gaslighting, it's survival.
It turns systemic administrative failure into a personal wellness deficit. Under those conditions, a culture of care is just a corporate buzzword used by leadership to avoid hiring more staff or fixing shift rotations. We are asking individuals to meditate their way out of structural collapse.
Look, individual resilience is the mandatory prerequisite for any systemic change to actually take root. You cannot build a structurally sound building with crumbling bricks.
Sure, but the building is crushing the bricks.
But if an individual officer cannot self-regulate, they cannot effectively engage in peer support. They cannot protect their family from secondary or vicarious trauma. A broken system is infinitely more destructive to an officer who has no internal defense mechanisms. You're looking at the system as the only mechanism for relief, but the officer has to survive the shift tonight.
Oh, I completely agree they need defenses tonight, but the sequence matters. If the department culture views taking time off for mental health as a weakness, or if union demands force a 16-hour shift, the officer is structurally prevented from utilizing these somatic tools.
Which is why the culture has to shift.
But the structure of the job fundamentally opposes the boundaries required to heal. If a critical call comes in, you can't say, actually, I'm protecting my windmill of tolerance right now, dispatch someone else.
No, of course not, but fostering a culture of care must be an operational imperative, not a buzzword. And that starts from the ground up. Who builds that culture? It's built by individuals who have mastered their own physiological responses and therefore recognize the absolute necessity of it in others.
So the officers have to fix themselves to fix the culture?
In a way, yes. When an officer uses these somatic tools and realizes, wow, my hypervigilance is biological, not a personal failing, that destroys the stigma. That individual realization scales up. It leads to volunteer-driven, strictly confidential peer support programs. It leads to demanding proactive mental health screenings as a standard of readiness rather than a punitive measure. Destigmatizing trauma-informed therapy begins when the officers themselves realize that psychological well-being is exactly as vital as tactical proficiency.
But again, look at human giver syndrome. The job is designed to consume the giver. The public demands it.
The boundary isn't refusing the 911 call.
Then what is it?
The boundary is what happens when the uniform comes off. The boundary is refusing to let the job consume the entirety of the officer's identity. It's about deliberately disengaging from the hypervigilance during off-duty hours, creating a literal safe zone at home with spouses and children where work talk is limited, allowing the parasympathetic nervous system to finally fully take over.
Easier said than done.
Of course. But the culture of care extends to the family, who often absorb the emotional fallout of CPTSD. By utilizing cognitive reframing, the officer can separate the tragedy of the 12-hour shift from the safety of their living room. That is a boundary they have total control over, regardless of systemic administrative failures.
So we are essentially looking at a dual requirement. The individual must aggressively, mechanically manage their own biology while simultaneously fighting to carve out protected psychological spaces in an industry explicitly designed to consume them.
Precisely. It is a lifelong commitment to well-being. The fight-or-flight response is primal. Managing it is a continuous active practice, much like physical training. You don't go to the gym once and expect to stay fit for a decade.
Right?
And you don't do one box breathing exercise and expect to be cured of CPTSD. You utilize pendulation, titration, and cycle completion every single day to keep the biological engine from tearing itself apart.
All right, well, let me summarize my position as we draw this debate to a close. I believe the physiological understanding of trauma we've unpacked today, the mechanics of the vagus nerve acting as a brake, the role of the amygdala in hijacking the prefrontal cortex, the concept of frozen energy, is profoundly illuminating.
It really is.
However, I remain highly cautious about the application. Listeners should approach these individual focus methods with a critical eye. A mindful pause or a diaphragmatic breathing exercise, while biologically sound, cannot single-handedly fix the systemic operational overload that officers face. We must be incredibly careful not to let the promise of self-regulation become an excuse for institutional neglect. A garden hose might cool a single tree, but it won't stop the forest fire of a fundamentally broken, understaffed system.
That's a fair warning. And to summarize my stance, while systemic change is undeniably necessary, the body-centered techniques we've explored are an absolute must-try biological imperative for survival right now. Frontline heroes do not have the luxury of waiting for the system to fix itself.
True.
They're dealing with the chemical and somatic realities of trauma today. Through breathwork, titration, and completing the stress cycle, officers can safely process the horrors they witness without being consumed by them. They build new neural pathways that literally prove to the brain that they are safe. These are not soft wellness tips. They are fundamental tools required for sustained service and preserving the human being behind the badge.
It is a friction that doesn't resolve easily between the biology of the individual and the administration of the profession. And this is exactly why dissecting the ideas presented in Shielded Minds is so vital. For anyone navigating high-stress, trauma-exposed environments, the methods we've discussed, from cognitive reframing to somatic experiencing, are a must-try for immediate physiological regulation.
Absolutely.
But they must be approached with caution, regarding the realistic limits of self-care in the absolute absence of robust systemic support.
There is immense value in considering these multiple perspectives. I mean, the biological mechanics offer a concrete roadmap out of the trauma response, but the operational realities demand severe pragmatism. There is a great deal more nuance to explore within this material, particularly in how peer support and leadership can actively bridge the gap between the isolated individual and the massive institution.
The uniform, as we established at the start, is a symbol of strength. It is a shield. But perhaps the most dangerous myth we ask our protectors to believe is that the shield makes them impervious to the human experience. If we are asking them to walk into the darkest corners of society, we cannot just hand them a psychological Band-Aid, demand they set better boundaries, and look the other way. We have to ensure that the hand holding the shield is tended with unwavering structural care.
Well said.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate. Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and we will see you next time.